Oh, I think we might be live and I think we might be on. So, assuming that either of those two things are true, I will tell you welcome to the Saturday edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I will sort of respond and reflect on a video that Rick Beato posted the other day. Let me get my water next to me. And I found it really interesting. His premise was that this era, the 2025, the 2020s era of music, is one where there is no defining genre, not musically, not sociologically, not propagandistically in terms of what the media might want you to believe. There's just no single type or style of music that defines the genre. And I tend to agree. There's some sort of granularity, as they call it, that we can get into on that. But I think that a lot of it is true. Now, just again to sort of paraphrase what Rick was saying, we are in an era now where there is no central delivery system for content. There's no sort of singular pipeline whereby content is delivered and promulgated among us, where there used to be a record business with very central operations. There was a clearly defined radio and television business, whether network television or later things like VMTV on cable and satellite. Magazines very centralized, owned by major and some smaller corporations. But everything that was going on in popular music between, let's say, the 1940s, which is Rick started, and the turn of the 21st century, we had relatively centralized distribution systems, which means that if you were interested in the contemporary music of any given period between the 40s and the early 2000s, most people were at least somewhat familiar with the major artists of the day, because whether you were listening to them on FM radio, whether you were watching the MTV, whether you were watching, a late night show, Jay Leno, Carson before that, where the guests would be on, whether you're watching a musical variety show in the pre-MTV, but still centralized era like the Midnight Special, like Don Kirshner's rock concert, those types of things. There was a limited number of bands that would be in the sort of musical vernacular of your typical audience member, where today that's not the case, because there's so many more vectors and off ramps, if you will, of music distribution and music consumption. And so this theory, and all of that is Rick's theory. Now on to my theory, because what Rick said got me thinking. Was there an era? So okay, so if we're in an era today where there's no genres, and by that, it's everything and nothing, there's no single defining genre, there's just a mishmash of sort of everything. Was there an era in the sort of pre-internet, pre-streaming, pre-decentralized period? Was there an era when there were many genres that collectively defined a certain period of time? And I think there was. So let's look at the 1970s, because the 1970s, in terms of the pop music era, was definitely, in my view, the most musically and stylistically diverse of any decade. So if we're going to understand this, we have to go back to my old definition of what pop music is. And to me, pop music is when things that were not classical, which used to just mean folk music, the people's music, when this music became commercialized. And as a result of becoming commercialized, it became technologized, it became financialized, it became lucrative. And that actually, certainly in the beginning, I think made the music more sophisticated. You could argue that there are peaks and troughs in that equation, but certainly the idea of non-classical music being written down, being played by professional musicians, highly skilled ones in many cases, being distributed in very expensively equipped distribution networks. That would necessarily mean that more care was put into the composition and performance and recording of the music than in an era where a guy comes to the local tavern or saloon every Friday night and does his thing. And if he screws up or gets drunk Friday, well, he'll be back the next Friday and maybe he'll be slightly less drunk, or maybe the audience will be slightly more drunk, and that will all equalize that way. And so, in that sense, pop music began not when we first have sound recording, but a bit before, in sort of the mid 19th century, when we have a growing boom of published music. So, the first industry that helped to popularize music, that created pop music, was music publishing. The sheet music, oh, sheet indeed. And it was an incredibly big business. And when the player piano and other self playing instruments came along in the latter few decades of the 19th century, this just got the publishers to make rolls, which is like sheet music that can be read by a machine, spooky, like a player piano, which of course were very, very popular. The player piano is actually more popular than the early Edison cylinder sound recording, because while early sound recording was really low fidelity, the player piano sounds perfect because it is an actual piano. And while you might miss some of the nuance of having a human playing it for you, or a human such as you, assuming there's no dogs or cats watching this, playing it him or herself, when you have the piano rolls, which do have inflection and tempi decisions made by the artist who actually pressed those rolls into what they are, the actual sonics of the self-playing instrument, whether a player piano, a self-playing organ, it's the real instrument, so the sound is perfect. And that explains why those instruments were so very popular at the turn of the 20th century. So that's when pop music began. And then, of course, recorded technology got better and better. Radio came into it, and we're well into the era of pop music by the time you get to the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Now, let's now go a bit forward in time from the turn of the 20th century into the 1970s, and let's examine why, in my view, this is such a diverse decade in terms of musical variety. Well, look at all the genres you have. You have people playing traditional jazz, avant-garde jazz, jazz fusion, jazz rock, funky jazz. You have modern funk. You have traditional soul. You have traditional R&B. You have people by the end of the decade taking R&B into the direction of electrofunk. You have punk, you have new wave, you have jazz influenced progressive rock, North American hard progressive rock, British style classically influenced progressive rock. You have country rock, you have southern rock, two different things. You have country and western rock. You have blues based rock. What else do you have? You have singers, songwriters, you have neo folk, you have politically charged protest music, you have disco. I'm forgetting so many other genres. You have some of the beginnings of world music, people like Ravi Shankar still selling a lot of albums. You have the classical world, not quite dead yet in terms of record sales, and you could argue that conductors like Herbert von Karajan and Karl Böhm made some of their finest recordings and films in the 70s. And so you have that going on. Let me think of what other genres, because I'm sure you still have classic pop, even though classic pop was an era that was sort of that culminated in terms of its largest sense of popularity, 40s, 50s, early 60s. Most, if not all, of the great, mainly vocalists of the classic pop era were still going strong and still actually putting out some really good records. Sinatra was putting out great records in the decade. So was Andy Williams. Dean Martin had slowed down a bit, but he was still very popular, particularly on television. Bing Crosby put out some big hits. His duet with David Bowie, huge Christmas single at the time. You still had Perry Como putting out some great albums. My favorite Victor Moan album is from the late 70s. So you still had that. And so why is the 70s such an era where so many things coexisted? I think that there's several reasons. One is that it's sort of positioned in a very good place. So you've got the 1940s. So the year 1940 is literally 30 years ahead of 1970, and then you have the new millennium on the other 30-year side of the year 1970. So as a decade, it's pretty well placed to both be influenced by the pop music of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and to influence the pop music that came up to the turn of the 21st century. So there's the spatial positioning of the 70s, which is probably a bit of an esoteric argument, but I thought I'd get it out of the way. Now let's look at what was going on sociologically. The 70s was an era of inquiry. It was an era of curious minds, because when people are lied to, like they were lied into into the Vietnam War, when people experienced the first major economic downturn of the last sort of 25, 30 years, when the Bretton Woods standard was abandoned and inflation came in and the oil crisis, people start getting introspective. And I think that when you look at how the counterculture and the mainstream commercial culture interacted, there's always a gap between those two things. Just ask Gil Scott Heron, spoken word, another great thing that was going on in the 70s. But when you look at the 70s, I think there was much more narrow a gap between the sorry, I need to check this message. Just give me a second. Okay, never mind that. How do people put these things on mute? It's probably because they're less lazy. I'm very, very lazy. Anyway, let's have a nice lazy day together. Why not? So, being open-minded, embracing the counterculture, things like that were considered cool in the 70s. And yes, it is true that in every era of certainly the pop music and the pop culture era, the mainstream financialized establishment has always attempted to co-opt elements of the counterculture. But in the 70s, things were a bit more sincere compared to what came before or after. There was a genuine feeling that to be inquisitive, to be a bit anti-establishment, to be a bit open-minded was actually something that was cool. And you had people like you had politicians, conservative, both Democrat and Republican politicians, growing sideburns and things like that. You had people dressed interestingly compared to subsequent decades. It was just a pretty open minded time. And that in the music business translated into people having the time and the patience and the tolerance in some cases for all sorts of different genres, because many of those genres that I mentioned in the 70s, they weren't obscure. They sold. Jazz fusion records sold. Funky jazz fusion sold. Singer songwriter stuff, which today is almost extinct outside of like cafes and semi amateur venues like that, that sold huge. Every type of rock sold huge. The classic pop people sold huge. People that were on the softer side, the Carpenters, sold huge. People who were on the more, juvenile side in terms of their audience, the Osmonds sold big. Black Sabbath, very opposite of the Osmonds, they sold big. So it was an era when everyone sort of got a shot. And there was no huge superstar in the way that Michael Jackson dominated the 80s. He was around in the 70s, certainly, but he became a titan in the 80s, or the way the Beatles in the 60s, or Elvis in the 50s, or Sinatra in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But it was just a great time for sort of musical coexistence. And so I would say that in this sense, going back to what Rick Beato said, the 1970s is sort of the opposite of the 2020s, because we're in the 2020s, things are amorphous, ill-defined, and you cannot really even name one, let alone two genres that's emblematic of the era. In the 1970s, I think I named at least 10 that sold well in the era, and you can think of at least 5 that are emblematic. I mean, was disco emblematic? Yeah, but so too was putting on a pair of blue jeans, popping open a can of beer, and listening to Bad Company. Those two things are equally emblematic of the 70s. Smoking weed and listening to James Taylor, just as emblematic as dropping acid and listening to Dark Side of the Moon. Totally different genres, but all of them have not only a musically relevant but a sociologically emblematic status in that decade. Now, the 60s had great music, as did the 50s, as did the 80s, but there was, again, something about the 70s where it all sort of came together. The first mainstream hip hop song, Rapper's Delight by Sugar Hill Gang, came out in the very end of the 70s. So, again, a decade where so much happened, musically speaking, of course. And you could argue that in other areas so much happened too. And we could always compare and contrast this. But look, in the 60s, you had classic pop, you had easy listening, you had you had jazz, still not selling huge, but respectably. Definitely respectably. You had rock and roll and its various evolving forms. In the 50s, of course, classic pop, doo-wop, R&B, uh, doo-wop and R&B related, early rock and roll, the birth of rock and roll, which itself related to doo-wop and R&B. In the 40s, you had the big bands, the swinging big bands. You had very early bebop at the end of the decade. You had sort of the classic pop iterations of that decade, and so on and so forth. Again, though, diverse? Yeah, sure, absolutely. Every decade, even now, we just can't define it as well, but it's still musically diverse. But there is something about the 70s when things just all sort of happened at once. They all sold well, and they all, not all, but many, if not most, helped to absolutely define the era. Very much the opposite of what is happening now. So if Rick Beato is right, and I think he is, about 2025 having no real easily identifiable musical trend, the 70s had multiple easily identifiable culture shaping unavoidable trends. That's why I think why that happened. Let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments. As always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.